Hello everyone, welcome back to Questing Beast. Today I'm going to show a couple different ways that you can draw place markers. So that means cities or other geological, but mostly human-made locations that can show up on a map. So different symbols and different ways you can draw that. This isn't going to be things like forests or rivers, but smaller locations that could be of interest on your map. So there's a couple different ways you can draw this. Let's start with cities, for example. A common way of drawing them I've seen is drawing them with a kind of isometric point of view, so it's sort of fake 3D. You're basically drawing the actual city itself, or a simplified version of it. So just a couple buildings or the walls, and so on. Obviously, usually this is much larger than real scale, but it looks nice for the most part if you're good at drawing that sort of thing. So for example, you could draw, when you're drawing a town, you could draw the actual walls. Draw little towers. Like so. Add some actual buildings on the inside. Maybe draw a keep in the background if it was a castle kind of situation. A situation like that. It's more or less like a little town. You could draw other things like drawing towers. Maybe that's some kind of wizard's tower. Draw smaller towns, often with ring walls. Same general idea. Going around. You can just simply draw castles on their own or fortresses. So something like a large keep-like structure. Little side towers, windows. You can add in more detail. For example, shadows being cast by structures like this. And the effect will come across pretty well. Some other shapes you can draw. For example, a windmill. Or tall, skinny tower. Or even just like a small village on its own. Those sorts of things will all look fine. That's the sort of fake 3D, or it's more or less 3D looking. If you want your towns to look like you're looking at them kind of from the side. So other major ways of drawing cities or towns are to draw them down from the top. There's a couple ways of doing things like that. You can simply draw in the shape of their walls, for example. And then draw in maybe like the keep, if there's a castle in there. Some interior buildings. You can simplify it down. Just have a large wall shape. A little cluster of buildings inside. If you don't want to have walls, and you had, say, a road moving through an area, you could just draw some rectangular shapes around it. Give the impression of a village. There's other ways of drawing, for example, castles or keeps. So a way I like drawing it is you're basically drawing a squarish shape. It's kind of roundish shapes around the edges. So it's like you're looking at a castle or a fortress from top down. So these would be the towers around the sides. And that reads well, I think, as a castle. Or you could draw a more circular shape. And that's alright as well. Other things you can do, depending on the look you want and the scale that you're going for, you can just kind of outline the area that the town or city takes up, and then just draw in very hastily some road structures. Road going in and out of the town. And that could read like a town as well. It's more detailed, and it depends on the scale that you're going for. Other things that you can do, going straight down from the top, you can kind of create a cross-hatched area. This often reads as fields, wheat fields, or just agricultural area. So you can do that as well. So let's see, some other ways of doing it. You can also draw the towns or buildings flat, but not from the top, instead flat from the side. So you can just draw some basic shapes as icons to represent. That could represent a village, for example. Or you could even simplify it down to something as simple as that. You could draw a simple castle shape. Like that. Or a simple tower. And those all work pretty well. I do tend to prefer flatter, simpler shapes. They're easier to draw, less likely to make mistakes, and they'll read quite easily as locations. These, of course, are fun. You can get quite elaborate with them, but they do take a while. So let's look at some more abstract icons that you could use for places. Very simple ones. A lot of people simply use a dot to represent a town, and then you can get larger with that to represent larger towns. For example, a dot surrounded by a circle, or you can even have a circle surrounded by another circle, etc. You could have simply an empty circle. You could go with a star, often used to represent a capital or a place of a city of special importance. You can put a circle around it if you want. You can also use a square. Squares read pretty well as cities or human buildings, or larger versions of that, a square with maybe another square around it to represent a larger group of buildings. Other things that you can do, you can draw things like, for example, flags. Not as commonly done, but it looks interesting. A couple different ways you can draw flags. You can use this to represent cities. Of course, what's important is that whatever technique you use, that you're consistent with it. Have a key or a legend in part of your map that makes it clear what the different symbols mean. As long as the symbols look good together and are consistent, you can basically do as you please. A little 3D flag flowing in the breeze. So those are some options. What you can also do, I'm going to give you some interesting ideas for just place markers, things that aren't cities necessarily, but points of interest, I guess you could call them, on your map. Most people don't add these things to their maps, but I think they make your maps a lot more interesting. They add a sort of depth to them, where you can see a little bit more of the details, and they flesh out some of the history and the geography of your place. This is especially useful if you're doing this for a role-playing game, and you want to have interesting places to go. If you show this to your players, they'll see lots of interesting locations nearby they can go to, other than just cities. Skyrim did that very well. So for example, if it's a site of a major battle, do something like that, like 2 crossed swords. Or the other way if you prefer. You can draw, if you have mountain ranges, or in any of the styles that I've shown, you can always add a triangle like that, for example, to represent a particularly interesting mountain. Maybe color it in. If there's a particular peak that you want named, maybe that represents the summit. You could also draw it like, for example, that looks more like a mountain. For areas out in the water, it can be an interesting idea to add things like shipwrecks, for example. One way you can draw that is draw a line and draw like a little wedge shape. And draw a mast like that coming out. So it looks like a ship kind of floundering in the water. Another way to draw this is drawing an anchor. It's more or less like that. Of course, you can also draw an anchor to represent a port, which is a good idea. Instead of drawing a city icon near water, use an anchor symbol to represent that it's a port city. That adds some interest to your map. Other points of interest could be represented with just an X, for example. Maybe ruins or lost locations. It feels a bit like the X from the classical treasure maps. So it seems like a good symbol to use. Other things you can do, maybe a symbol for an encampment. There's like a local encampment nearby. Draw like a little flame. Draw little wooden logs under it. Kind of looks like a campfire. Or maybe a little tent. Something like that, to represent an encampment or a temporary settlement. Other ideas, draw things like moons to represent areas often inhabited at night. Another interesting idea is to, instead of just using these symbols or these city symbols for every kind of city, if you have several different factions or civilizations or species within your map, you can use different symbols to represent cities of the different races. And that can be really interesting because you'll be able to read very quickly who the city belongs to. So you could use symbols like a moon, for example, if it was another civilization. use diamonds instead of squares. Could represent treasure. I've seen people use this 3-dot symbol, or if there's a magical location, you could always just use a classic pentagram symbol, read easily as a magical area, etc. Oh, another idea is that you could use a crown symbol for a capital. Something like that, instead of using that or that. Another interesting idea that I've seen from Skyrim especially is that instead of doing drawing their cities like that, they actually have shields that represent the coat of arms of that city. And that's a visually appealing way of representing it. So you could just draw a shield and then, you know, have a coat of arms on it, what have you. Skyrim's a great example to take for all sorts of things here. They have lots of great, very visually interesting, but instantly recognizable symbols that they use on their map when you're traveling around Skyrim and exploring. So they're a great inspiration for this sort of thing. You can also draw things like flags, for example, when you're marking countries, or smaller areas, provinces, or baronies, or what have you. I remember one of the first nations that I made up when I was a lot younger was called Antarctica, and it had this flag that was a phoenix. It looked something like this. It had vertical stripes going down that way. So having a flag can mark an area very nicely and also give you some depth, some information on the back history of the place you're talking about. In terms of roads, I usually draw roads just as a series of dots, like that. You can also draw them as dashes, or conceivably just as lines. But what's important, of course, is that you maintain consistency across your whole map. Make sure that you label which ones are roads, which ones are, for example, sea lanes, or maybe national borders, or other things like that. Otherwise, people will get confused. So it needs to be clear what you're using. Yeah, those are basically some ideas I have. I'm sure everyone else uses other symbols. If you have any other ideas or things that you think look good, or you've seen in other maps that you like especially, let me know in the comments. And other than that, remember to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.